In a bold and unprecedented step, Donald Trump has unleashed a total economic offensive on Canada. This goes way past any routine tariff adjustment or basic trade restriction. It isn't the kind of measured pressure that nations usually apply when negotiating from strength, carefully preserving an exit strategy for when the political winds shift. No, this time every instrument in America's vast economic toolkit was deployed simultaneously against a close ally. Sweeping tariffs hit every single Canadian export. New financial regulations cut off Canadian financial entities from American markets. Energy policies targeted the long-standing integrated supply chains spanning the border for over 40 years. Supply chains for key minerals were severed. Diplomatic ties were scaled back significantly. Executive authority was invoked to freeze cross-border capital flows and investments. All these measures landed at once, without any phased introduction, exemptions, or preliminary negotiations. The full economic power of the globe's largest economy came crashing down on a country roughly one-tenth its size, with the explicit aim of forcing complete submission to American demands on trade. What happened next reveals why this episode stands out today. It wasn't simply that Canada fought back. Countries frequently counter trade pressures, after all. But Canada avoided the conventional response altogether. Instead, it activated a sophisticated, pre-engineered, multi-tiered counter-strategy that had been meticulously developed, refined, and readied well in advance of the declaration. The objective of this blueprint was straightforward yet devastating: to transform every American economic weapon into a boomerang that would strike back at the U.S. economy itself. Trump didn't just fail to win the battle he picked. He essentially provided the very instruments for his own setback. In the 72 hours after the declaration, it wasn't Canada's economy that crumbled. Rather, it was America's broader strategic position that took the hits. Energy prices surged sharply in 14 northern U.S. states within just 2 days. American manufacturers dependent on Canadian inputs experienced production declines even prior to the policies fully kicking in. The U.S. dollar weakened against several partner currencies as pre-arranged financial arrangements reduced global reliance on dollar-denominated holdings. A trio of major sovereign wealth funds from abroad disclosed adjustments away from American assets. Lawmakers representing agricultural regions convened emergency sessions once specific Canadian retaliatory tariffs immediately closed off their primary export destinations. At the same time, Pentagon officials briefed Congress on looming shortages of essential minerals that threatened to delay defense production timelines by over 12 months. The declaration had been designed to demonstrate overwhelming U.S. economic supremacy, making any resistance appear futile. Yet it instead exposed how deploying brute force without accounting for the target's preparedness reveals weakness rather than strength. Legendary investor Warren Buffett hailed it as one of the most brilliantly executed defensive maneuvers in modern economic history. He pointed out that Mark Carney had demonstrated a principle well understood by top strategists in business and finance. The most dangerous moment for any aggressor comes right at the point of total engagement. Once every resource is committed and nothing is held in reserve, there's zero flexibility left to adapt, no buffer for unexpected developments, and no capacity to pivot. And if the opponent has spent months analyzing the aggressor's arsenal and crafting specific counters for each element, that moment of full commitment becomes the height of vulnerability, not victory. Buffett observed that Trump didn't succeed in dominating Canada. Instead, he supplied the means for Canada to counter effectively, with those very same tools now being wielded against the U.S., with the precision of a plan orchestrated over a full year, specifically for this scenario. But let's dive into exactly what Carney put into action, the specific components, the architecture of the strategy, and the documented timelines that confirm it was prepared long before the surprise announcement. As you discover the inner workings of this system, how each element was engineered to reverse a U.S. action into self-inflicted damage, why it actually gained effectiveness under heavier pressure, and what Buffett emphasized regarding the contrast between sheer might and strategic foresight, you'll understand why this transcended a typical bilateral trade spat. This became the moment the entire confrontation effectively ended, not via capitulation, but because one party came to recognize that every conceivable move had been anticipated, diffused, and converted into the source of its own undoing. The repercussions from this policy rollout are rippling through the American economy faster than officials can track. The defensive framework operates autonomously now, requiring no additional decisions from Canadian leadership to maintain its momentum. The U.S. administration has yet to identify any de-escalation option that wouldn't inflict even greater damage than persisting with the standoff. Allow me to outline precisely the scope of Trump's announcement, because its comprehensive nature is central to understanding the fallout. This wasn't about incrementally raising the stakes. It represented a profound transformation. The conflict moved from a negotiable trade friction into uncharted territory for relations between friendly nations since the era of the Second World War. Previous actions had been targeted and calibrated, duties on select products, restrictions in specific sectors, each calibrated to build bargaining leverage without triggering a total economic rupture that would devastate both sides irreparably. That incremental style preserved options for Washington. It permitted scaling up or dialing down without losing face. It maintained open channels for dialogue. The new declaration slammed all those doors shut. It converted the dynamic from a calculated strategic contest where participants retain maneuverability into an attempt to dismantle the opponent's economic base so completely that continued resistance became unsustainable. The administration framed it as decisive statesmanship. However, analysts who scrutinized the package applied a different label: irreversible. The package included 6 coordinated elements, each striking a distinct pillar of the Canadian economy concurrently. The initial component featured comprehensive tariffs. Rather than selective duties on particular categories, these applied across the board to all incoming goods. Every product from Canada arriving in the U.S. incurred rates ranging from 25 to 50% depending on classification. There were no exceptions carved out for integrated production chains, no phased implementation for industries needing transition periods, no preferential handling for items critical to American consumers, and no grandfathering of existing contracts. The tariff wall went up instantly and was structured for total coverage. The second element imposed financial constraints. American financial institutions were prohibited from processing certain transactions involving Canadian government entities. Access for Canadian banks to U.S. capital markets came under heightened scrutiny, creating procedural delays, elevated expenses, and amplified regulatory risks for participating U.S. banks. This wasn't framed as an outright sanction. It functioned more like a regulatory choke point, not fully outlawing dealings but rendering them sufficiently expensive and hazardous that institutions would self-censor and pull back voluntarily. The practical impact mirrored a direct penalty without the associated legal or diplomatic formalities, thereby sidestepping typical avenues for international objections or litigation. Third came the energy restrictions, U.S. Companies were barred from entering fresh supply agreements with Canadian energy suppliers. Existing agreements would be allowed to expire without renewal. A phased reduction strategy aimed to wean the U.S. off Canadian energy over a 2-year period. While it sounded measured on paper, the execution exposed vulnerabilities, as energy infrastructure in 14 states simply lacked alternative supplies at the required capacity within the time frame. The fourth targeted critical minerals. Canadian-sourced materials were subjected to national security protocols, imposing import quotas, intensified inspections, processing bottlenecks, and directives to source alternatives with the ultimate goal of eliminating dependence on Canada. The fifth encompassed diplomatic measures, withdrawing the American ambassador, reducing consular presence in Canadian urban centers, and suspending collaborative forums covering defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, border security, and environmental initiatives. Finally, the sixth invoked special economic authorities to suspend select cross-border investment activities and block Canadian acquisitions of U.S. holdings in strategic sectors. 6 distinct yet synchronized attacks on 6 foundational aspects of the bilateral relationship, all engineered to overwhelm resistance, disrupt operations, and render opposition so immediately destructive that compliance would appear the sole rational path. Specialists examining the package uniformly agreed it had crossed a critical threshold. Not that any single step was entirely novel in isolation. Tariffs had been floated previously, financial curbs discussed, energy leverage tested, but the combination all at once, directed at a long-standing partner, and framed as permanent until total acquiescence, was without precedent. This wasn't positioned as an initial negotiating position. It constituted an ultimatum enforced through immediate unilateral implementation. The measures were active right away. Damage was underway immediately. Canada received no invitation to negotiate terms. It was instructed to submit. Global observers braced for a predictable Canadian counter, reciprocal tariffs mirroring restrictions, formal protests lodged at international bodies, diplomatic outreach to allies, appeals to organizations like the UN, WTO, and G7. The textbook playbook for a smaller power facing economic aggression from a superpower: absorb the initial blow, respond proportionately, seek multilateral support, and wait for domestic political shifts within the aggressor nation to force a rethink. That method is time-consuming and expensive. It depends on the defender enduring prolonged pain until international opinion builds sufficient counter-pressure. What Canada executed, however, broke new ground entirely. Just 12 hours after the announcement, Mark Carney addressed the nation on television, not in the frantic high-stress emergency format typical of leaders caught off guard by a major crisis. Instead, he delivered a composed, carefully prepared national address that had been booked with broadcasters 3 days prior to the U.S. declaration. That scheduling detail alone indicated prior awareness, not based on intelligence leaks or insider tips, but from 18 months of closely monitoring Trump's pattern of escalation and concluding that full-scale economic confrontation was not merely possible but inevitable. A leader who interprets restraint as weakness and compromise as endorsement will continue to press forward. And sustained pressure inevitably leads to total commitment. The real question was never whether Trump would initiate economic hostilities, but exactly when, and Carney had utilized that lead time to engineer a robust reply. He presented it to Canadians and international audiences in his characteristic steady manner, calm, analytical, reminiscent of a seasoned financier reviewing figures. No anger, no defiance, no emotional rhetoric. The very absence of drama underscored the message. This response wasn't improvised under duress. It was the activation of a long-developed contingency plan. Carney explained that Canada had anticipated comprehensive U.S. economic measures for more than a year. During that window, the country had designed, funded, and implemented an extensive economic resilience architecture engineered to engage automatically upon such a declaration. This wasn't about vengeance or retaliation. It was a sophisticated redirection mechanism and institutional setup designed to convert each element of the American offensive into disproportionately greater costs for the U.S. side. Then came the statement that reverberated around the globe within minutes. This framework requires no ongoing involvement from my office. It needs no emergency legislation. It doesn't depend on committee approvals for each action. It is embedded within our institutions and contractual obligations. It is already operational. It was structured to launch automatically when specific triggers were met, and those triggers were activated this morning. These words landed with significant impact in Washington, signaling that the fundamental assumptions had shifted. There was no single individual left to negotiate against, no political figure to strong arm, no counterpart to threaten. The countermeasures existed independently within established institutions and binding agreements. Disabling them would require unraveling arrangements spanning multiple nations, halting ongoing projects, and terminating pacts that benefited participating governments who had no incentive to accommodate Canada unilaterally. This wasn't merely a governmental policy position. It was an operational machine, and machines don't negotiate. He then presented the documentation, and the room went quiet. Every agreement displayed, trade arrangements, financial safeguards, allied commitments, energy diversion contracts, bore timestamps from months earlier. Implementation timelines had already begun, and partner obligations were in effect weeks before the U.S. actions. The system hadn't been hastily assembled in reaction to the news. It had been quietly operational in standby mode for an extended period, dormant but fully prepared, armed and awaiting precisely this catalyst. The timestamps provided irrefutable evidence, demonstrating to U.S. leadership what no standard economic analysis or intelligence report could. The moves had been precisely forecasted. The scenario of total confrontation had been modeled, neutralized, and weaponized against the initiator long beforehand. Every facet of the U.S. announcement encountered a tailored countermeasure within Carney's architecture. For each tool deployed, a corresponding response was live and active. The overall system comprised 5 core components, each engineered to redirect one specific American pressure point back as opposing pressure. First, the Energy Redirection Initiative. Trump's attempt to choke off Canadian energy sales to the American market was countered by rerouting supplies to pre-identified international buyers through already operational infrastructure. Facilities on the Pacific Coast, northern passages, and established energy agreements with nations including Japan, South Korea, and European Union members activated in unison. American energy prices climbed within 48 hours, not because Canada withheld deliveries to the U.S., but because supplies previously flowing southward under favorable fixed rates were now directed to other markets at premium global prices. Utilities serving 14 northern states, dependent on Canadian natural gas for heating, encountered sudden deficits they couldn't fulfill through domestic production quickly enough. The energy lever didn't harm Canada. It profited Canadian exporters while forcing the U.S. to scramble for substitutes unavailable at the necessary volume or pace. The second component involved financial countermeasures. U.S. efforts to isolate Canadian entities from capital markets were met with pre-established currency swap agreements activated with the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and Bank of England. Canadian financial institutions shifted dollar-based activities into alternative currency frameworks. The restrictions didn't sever Canada from global finance. Instead, they diminished the centrality of the U.S. dollar in major regional transactions. Reduced demand for dollars became evident, exerting a subtle but noticeable downward pressure on its value. International markets interpreted this as a warning signal. The dollar's long-standing role as the default currency for North American commerce could no longer be assumed automatic. Within days, 3 sovereign wealth funds announced modest portfolio reallocations, not massive divestments, but strategic adjustments that conveyed a powerful message. The nation issuing the currency had compromised its reliability as a stable medium for trade. Third was the Alliance Activation Protocol. This transformed what Washington viewed as a bilateral issue into a multilateral challenge unexpectedly. Pre-negotiated mutual economic defense agreements with the European Union, United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, and Australia triggered automatically upon the declaration of economic conflict. These weren't vague statements of solidarity or diplomatic communications. They were enforceable contracts carrying specific obligations, enhanced trade preferences for Canada, reinforced supply chain integrations, safeguards for investments, coordinated regulatory alignments, creating an instant protective network that required no desperate appeals or last-minute haggling from Ottawa. The assistance was predetermined, the commitments binding, and the activation self-executing. Canada didn't request help from partners. The help materialized directly as a contractual consequence of the U.S. move. Trump's action didn't just trigger Canada's defenses, it forged a coordinated economic bloc of 7 nations now aligned against the United States. The fourth element featured precision-targeted counter-tariffs. Canada's responses weren't broad or proportional in scale. They were surgically directed based on detailed market intelligence at American export sectors with limited alternative buyers. Agricultural products from regions where Canada represented 30 to 50% of total sales volume. Manufacturing goods from locales where Canadian purchasers weighed corporate profits against employment impacts. The goal wasn't simple tit-for-tat equivalence, but maximizing domestic political backlash within the U.S. for every unit of economic pain inflicted. Each measure struck constituencies whose protests would echo loudest in Washington corridors. Within 72 hours, representatives from farm-heavy states were calling for immediate hearings. Within a week, several Republican senators from rural districts publicly called for reconsideration of the entire policy. These targeted duties avoided mirroring the overall magnitude of U.S. tariffs. They successfully converted the American measures into a pressing internal political crisis for the U.S. The fifth focused on critical minerals denial. Leveraging ownership regulations, Canada diverted all relevant exports away from the United States entirely, an immediate and comprehensive halt rather than phased reduction. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, uranium, every strategic material Trump had designated as vital for security, became unavailable from the United States' primary supplier. Defense contractors faced abrupt supply disruptions. Semiconductor producers dealt with raw material deficits. Electric vehicle manufacturers encountered production setbacks. According to reports, a closed-door Pentagon briefing described the mineral shortages as the most acute threat to procurement since the rare earth challenges around 2010. Unlike that earlier episode, however, diplomatic resolutions weren't available. The resources had already been contractually committed to processors in South Korea, Japan, and Europe. Supplies weren't being stockpiled for leverage. They were permanently reassigned under agreements featuring stiff financial penalties for reversal. The cascading impacts propagated through the U.S. economy at a velocity that demonstrated the administration's complete lack of anticipation. None of the elements, energy diversions, financial pivots, multilateral triggers, precision tariffs, or mineral cutoffs, had been factored into their planning. The declaration presumed Canada would follow traditional protocols, reciprocal actions, formal international grievances, gradual and burdensome resistance that develops slowly and takes considerable time to implement, affording the initiator opportunities to consolidate advantages. It hadn't accounted for an adversary that had exhaustively studied each potential U.S. instrument over 12 months and prepared exact, ready-to-deploy answers. The gap between anticipated outcomes and actual developments was enormous and expanded rapidly as each layer of the system engaged, each countermeasure came online, and consequences accumulated for American stakeholders who had been assured the policy would yield benefits, not liabilities. In an extraordinary development, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued a statement within 72 hours that differed markedly from prior positions on presidential trade initiatives. It didn't call for dialogue or modifications. It proposed no adjustments, exemptions, or timeline revisions. Instead, it insisted on the immediate and total rescission of the measures, citing swift and substantial damage to American competitiveness across major sectors. The statement detailed how elevated energy expenses were eroding manufacturing advantages in states that had been globally competitive just days earlier, but now confronted costs 15 to 20% higher than international competitors. It highlighted mineral shortages jeopardizing timelines in defense and technology, particularly semiconductors and battery production. Farm export shortfalls were described as triple initial projections, with revenue outlooks slashed to levels that threatened community stability. It also addressed financial market concerns stemming from dollar weakness, which increased financing costs at a critical juncture when reliability was paramount. Notably, the document featured endorsements from the chief executives of 47 prominent American corporations. 47 CEOs taking a public, named stand against a core economic policy of the president so soon after its introduction, not through discreet back channels but openly and on record. Corporate America had progressed beyond skepticism to active resistance, with their dissent formally documented and disseminated widely to press and lawmakers. By this juncture, the policy had evolved from a mere miscalculation into an entanglement from which escape seemed elusive. Carney's framework adhered to one fundamental principle that distinguished it from conventional defensive strategies in trade conflicts. The principle was simple in concept but formidable in application. Every potential exit ramp for the aggressor carried higher costs than maintaining the current course. Should Trump attempt to withdraw or ease the pressure, the inflicted damages persist. Energy reroutes are secured under binding contracts complete with hefty termination fees. The multinational partnership operates under solid agreements with mechanisms that outlast the initial dispute. Currency adjustments have been executed and market expectations recalibrated. Mineral supplies have been allocated to new partners who have invested in corresponding processing capacity. De-escalation doesn't restore the status quo ante. It instead creates a hybrid outcome where the United States absorbs the full expenses of the conflict without securing any of the intended advantages, while Canada's economic orientation has permanently pivoted toward diversified non-U.S. partnerships that won't simply dissolve upon a policy reversal in Washington. These new linkages possess independent momentum, established infrastructures, and vested interests among participants who benefit from their continuation. Stepping back doesn't resolve the damage, it cements it permanently, as terminating the conflict removes the justification for reversing the shifts even as those shifts continue operating at full capacity. If Trump opts to intensify the pressure instead, the system includes additional escalation tiers not yet activated but deliberately constructed to respond to further aggression. Carney referenced their existence without elaborating details. The ambiguity served a purpose. The message was clear that additional capabilities exist and testing them would be inadvisable. Should the U.S. attempt to undermine the framework through intelligence operations, cyber actions, or diplomatic pressure on partner nations, the components are distributed across 7 sovereign countries, each exercising independent control. Disrupting a bilateral trade accord between Canada and Japan isn't feasible from the White House. Influencing the European Central Bank to abandon a currency arrangement endorsed by its own analysts for continental stability proves equally challenging. The design of the system inherently resists concentrated countermeasures by being deliberately decentralized. And if the administration chooses inaction, the framework continues advancing under its inherent dynamics. It requires no fresh directives from Canadian authorities, no rushed legislation, no bureaucratic clearances. It functions through pre-existing contracts, physical infrastructure, and international commitments that operate beyond the reach of day-to-day governmental intervention. Remaining passive equates to enduring the system's program timeline, a timeline calibrated to impose costs on the U.S. economy at approximately triple the rate experienced by Canada. Every passing day of inaction further amplifies that disparity. This development forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about power in the global economy. Raw size and immediate force, it turns out, can be outmaneuvered by preparation, foresight, and institutional resilience. What do you think this means for future international relations? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how this shifts your view on trade strategy and economic statecraft.